Right. Oh, that's not what you want to see, is it? Well, can you see my PowerPoint now or not? Yes.
Yes.
Yes, with the medium-term planning.
It's not on the slideshow, Richard. It's still an I. That's it.
Can you see that now? Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So back at the beginning there, because I can't actually see what you're seeing. So yeah, you okay with the opening title there? Opening slide.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So thanks everybody for coming and attending today. The first thing I'll say is I do apologise for that slight delayed start. I'm having great difficulty getting into the Zoom room, and I've just come from another Zoom call, so I think there must have been some sort of conflict going on. So again, I appreciate your patience. So my name's Richard. I'm a lecturer in education at the University of Dundee, and I usually teach primary STEM, science, technology, a little bit of maths education, and shouldn't leave out the engineering obviously as well. But I do have a real interest in sustainability, and I've worked with Claire and Sally in the One World Centre over the years in different projects and running CPD sessions and things like that. So what I'm going to do today is talk through an example of how I might teach the Sustainable Development Goals and link them to STEM teaching. So basically, the way I approach the SDGs, the global goals, is that they kind of cover everything that we would want to address in the future world for the young people, the children that we're teaching, to set it up so it's basically a better place, and try to limit some of the damage that's been done in certainly in recent decades, if not over the last few centuries. And when you look at them, some of them are a lot more obvious than others. And Sally mentioned just then the one that linked to education, and we'll obviously be aware of that. That's an important thing for all of us. But some of them are a little bit less obvious than others. And I'm going to pick a particular one to talk about shortly. And when I do that, I'll say why I think it might be a little bit less obvious, although in the current context, what's going on around the world, it could actually be a lot more perhaps relevant than we would have thought certainly 6 months ago. Now, whenever I would teach this in school, and if I go into schools and do any work around sustainability, some of the concepts are quite complex and quite abstract. Sally made reference to perhaps economic factors and the ability for us to be able to manage in a sort of sustainably economic way, and the resources available. And I think certainly in younger primary children, they might find that a little bit difficult. So what I would always try and do is introduce some form of context for the particular topic that you're covering for that goal. And I would get the children discussing that and exploring it in a little bit more detail. And when you're doing that, you're getting an idea for what they understand. Now, what I always say as well is young learners, and this goes into secondary as well, they don't have our life experience, so that, you know, they haven't watched as much news on the telly and they haven't engaged with as much content as us. So some of the ideas, they might have gaps in that knowledge, and you might need to help them. And last week I was helping my niece, who's 10, and she was looking at deforestation. And she could apply a lot of the ideas to herself, but she didn't really have a lot of good understanding of what we mean by rainforests, or even that the rainforests in South America would be different from those in Southeast Asia, to the different forests and woodland that is just near her house in the UK. So you might need to help them with that experience, and don't overestimate perhaps how much they know. However, they might also be able to learn a lot faster than you give them credit for. So what we sometimes see in teaching when we go into schools and we see people teaching, or we support teachers and work alongside them, is sometimes teachers can overestimate what the learners already know, but then underestimate their capacity to learn. So think about that when you're introducing something like this. Make sure that they've got enough knowledge so that they can access the learning. But then once they've got that, push them on and encourage them, and don't perhaps hold them back too much. So hopefully that makes sense as a start. I'm going to go into a little bit more detail in one of the Sustainable Development Goals. So we're going to look at Goal 3 in a bit more detail. And I mentioned before that some of them are a bit more obvious than others. And this is one that might have been overlooked a little bit. Health and wellbeing, it does feature heavily in a Scottish curriculum. And obviously it's an issue for schools wherever you are in the world. But when you look into it in a bit more detail, there are these sub-targets. So target 3.1 3.2, and then I picked out these 3 elements here because I think these do tie in with the current context that we've got with the global health crisis with COVID-19. So when you look in a bit more detail, the target relates here, 3.3, that you can see in the first box, relates to this fighting communicable diseases. And if you think about it, these are more diseases for what we'd perhaps say in the developing world, around diseases that perhaps might not feature in the sort of on the everyday lives of the sort of young people we're working with. But now with COVID-19, we have got a real context to think about that and the way in which these diseases are passed on as well. And then the target 3.B is around supporting research and development. So this idea of vaccinations, and obviously that's in the news at the moment because we're searching for this vaccination and how important that will be in the fight against COVID-19. And then target 3.D is this use of technology. And I think young people could really start to understand that, because what we could then do is we could explain the idea that these track and trace systems that are being used and been particularly effective in places like South Korea, use modern technology to tackle this global challenge that we've got around health and well-being. So if I was teaching this, the first thing I would do is I'd look at those SDGs, I would pick out the ones that I thought I would like to use to teach, and I would get into some detail and spend some time myself getting to know those in a little bit more depth and focus in on the particular bits that I think would be relevant to what I want to teach. Once I've done that, I would go and have a look at the experiences and outcomes. So you should all be familiar with these. And what I've done here is this view that you're seeing here is actually 2 separate parts of the E&O experience and outcome documents from Curriculum for Excellence in Scotland, and I've put them side by side. So within the science curriculum area, you've got biological systems, and then much later on, you've got topical science. And I've picked these out because I think these relate really well to what we're doing at the moment and what we're looking at the moment in this example with SDG 3 and in COVID-19. Now, I won't go into a huge amount of detail here, but 1 or 2 of the things I'll pick out from a science knowledge point of view, we've got this idea of respiratory systems. So it's actually stated there in the benchmarks that the children should have an understanding of this E&O should be exemplified by this understanding of the respiratory system. And obviously, that's a key element with the diagnosis of COVID-19. And then later on in the E's and O's is this idea of topical science. And this is where we could start looking at possibly the history of vaccinations and how data has been used to understand global health issues or national health issues as well. And then a little bit further on within that topical science, we've got this idea of scientific interest in the media and being what I would say would be a sort of discerning consumer of that media content, of which they're obviously coming from lots of different outlets and delivered in different ways. So that's the second level E's and O's. So we're looking at upper primary there. And then if I just move on very briefly, within the Curriculum for Excellence guidance, you've also got this focus on skills. So what I'm saying here is within STEM, don't just focus on the science, so the biology and the respiratory side of things, also have a look at the maths element. And these are some of the skills that you might be looking at here. And here we've got 2nd and 3rd level. So we're getting into the broad general education in secondary. And we're looking here at ideas around being scientifically literate and the processing of evidence and weighing up what we think the best evidence available to deal with a particular situation is as well. And then developing these informed views. And if you're interested in learning a bit more about scientific literacy, then I would recommend the Ben Goldacre work. He was a doctor and he became a journalist. And he's done a lot of investigative work around what he calls bad science. So there's a few books available that are really accessible on that topic there. So these are the skills that you might deliver alongside the content covered in the E's and O's. And I just wanted to throw in as well, this is the national curriculum that is used in England. So this is year 6. So this is broadly P7, sort of going into secondary school. And I know most people won't be teaching this, but when you look at it, it's actually quite similar to what we're teaching in Scotland. And you can look here at the programme of study, the things that they're covering, and you'll notice they've talked about the circulatory system, so that's the sort of biology element, and then also this idea of working scientifically, what I was just talking about there, about being scientifically literate and the ability to carry out scientific inquiry, and a little bit lower down you can see recording data as well. So the reason I draw attention to that is because primary and early secondary science, technology, engineering, mathematics teaching is broadly the same wherever you are. And if you can get your own mind around that idea of having particular knowledge that you're teaching, so the idea of concepts around, say, circulatory systems in biology or respiratory systems, and then the skills alongside it, you can bring those together. You can deliver some coherent teaching for the young people. So if I was approaching some teaching using that, then my overall objectives for this would be that the children are going to get a decent knowledge of the SDGs. We're going to focus on it in a little bit more detail. I'm going to focus in on some science and mathematics, and I'm going to think about this idea of concepts, these big ideas or skills. And some of the things I might choose to look at based on SDG 3 would be data handling and statistics. We've all seen the graphs for COVID-19, so that's a good opportunity to introduce those. And then this idea of drawing out reasoned and evidence-based solution thinking from that, and being scientifically and research literate. And then finally, the context we're using is this global pandemic, of which the children will have had a lot of engagement with and will know an awful lot about. And certainly when the schools go back, I suspect the first few months will be still reacting to that and talking about that. Now, what I want to say here is I always put that the activities and the individual lessons come after this general overview of what I might be doing. And there are lots of interdisciplinary learning or cross-curricular learning opportunities, but what I would try and do is I would try and add those in later. So be clear on what it is you want to teach first before we move into these looking for IDL opportunities, because that way your teaching will be a little bit more focused. So I'm going to move on now. And if I was, I'm going to talk you through a little bit of planning that I might do for this. If I was going to plan some lessons on this and teaching on this topic, an SDG 3 around health and health outcomes, I would probably go for a medium-term plan. I'm saying roughly about 3 weeks here. So maybe, you know, sort of 15 half afternoons, maybe 2 or 3 hour lessons, depending what time you've got available. So what I might start with is a general historical knowledge of medicine and public health. So I said before, don't think about the ideal yet. Think about what your outcomes you want to deliver. But this might be an opportunity now to do a couple of history lessons, social subjects lessons around the development of medicine and public health. Then I might start thinking about the mathematics element and looking at the use of data in public health and the use of data handling and data literacy, and specifically statistics, which gets introduced in upper primary and certainly on into early secondary. And then I might focus in on some knowledge, so biological systems and respiratory systems or specific diseases and the way in which we can protect ourselves from those diseases. And then potentially some practical investigations, and a good example there might be a practical investigation around water purification, and Daisy's going to talk you through that in a short while, so just to set you up. So as I said, the thing I might start with is a little bit of a historical background to public health, and I don't know how many people are aware of this, but the history of epidemiology has been credited to John Snow, not the other John Snow or the other John Snows you're thinking of, but the scientist John Snow in Victorian period. And this was around the disease, some of you might know what this is, but around cholera, and it was specific deaths. Now, these graphs are available on a really nice set of resources that are available online from National Geographic. And they're not an educational organisation per se, but what they do have is they do have quite a strong, and it's US based, but they do have quite a strong focus on scientifically well-informed resources. So these are the two graphs from a worksheet that I was researching. And first, it's the example of where the deaths congregated, the little red dots. And then what you could do is you could get the children looking in more detail at where the water pumps were situated. And you could just leave it at that. And you could give them some, having introduced what cholera was and the effects of cholera, and then you could get them thinking a little bit about where the patterns were. And that's what data handling and statistics is. It's about looking for patterns and seeing them. Now, often when we teach data handling in primary school, we jump straight in with creating bar charts or graphing things or taking tally charts maybe. I would say let's start interpreting the data first, because that's what you're going to be doing in later life. That's what's going to be useful for you. And that's what's going to help you address that SDG 3 and the other ones as well. And then we could start talking about why it was that, for example, as well, there weren't so many deaths around Savile Row, where there was a lot more congregated around Broad Street. And we could open up some discussions around that. Now, then I might move it forward. I wouldn't do that in a single lesson. I might have a couple of lessons around that. And I might look at some modern day data and how we've used data during the COVID-19 crisis. Now, there's lots of really good graphs available and lots of websites. The problem is they're quite noisy, they're quite messy. And if you're teaching this to a 9-year-old or a 13-year-old, there's a lot of that contextual knowledge that you've got that they might not have. For example, countries. I mean, we've got a fair idea of all the countries in the world. So when you find graphs like this, you can change them and you can select them. So when I'm choosing resources to teach something like this, I'm very careful with what I pick, and if necessary, I adapt it. So I take the data and I put it maybe into an Excel spreadsheet and present it in a way that I know is going to be accessible for the young people. So what I then might do is present them with some data there, and I would ask them to try and interpret what's going on. And using real resources that you can snip from websites or you can copy and paste from websites is quite nice, because you can say that to them, it's come from this website, but then you adapt it slightly before you give it out to them to explore. And this is what was being discussed in the news about this attempt to flatten the curve. Now, again, you've got to be careful with the sources you're using, because a lot of the graphs are being published with a logarithmic scale, rather than the linear data. Now, I would start with linear data for later primary and early secondary, because we don't want to. There are reasons for presenting it in a different way, but I would start with just this idea of linear, and then you can see that graph going up. And it's not quite a bell curve. Normally you get a distribution of a bell curve. Again, you can decide whether you would get into that discussion with them or not. But ask them to explore that. Where's it going to go? And then you could have discussions about what we might do to stop this second wave coming. And they've probably discussed that at home. They've probably got some knowledge and understanding of that as well. So then if I was planning some activities around that, I might start with comparisons of graphs. I might use tables of data. I might take them from newspapers. Quite a nice activity is to try and find really bad examples of data handling, because there's loads of them. Fox News are great at this. If you go online and you look for bad examples of data handling on Fox News, and you can say to the kids, look, some journalist has put this out there. What have they done wrong? And then they can chat about that and talk about that. Lots of interpretation questions. So some real decisions. You could say, what's this trend showing here? Is it on the way down? Okay. Now we can get into a little bit of interdisciplinary learning and a little bit of discussion and debate, and say, all right, imagine you're a public health official. What would you do? You've got to justify your decision. And we can look at that in the pros and cons of reducing lockdown. And then I might move on, having been quite happy with that, for maybe a few lessons in a bit more specific detail and statistics on this idea of the reproduction rate, the reinfection rate, basically, the R rate. And you could do quite a nice little practical experiment where you have one of the class who is an infected person, and this idea that the R rate for COVID-19 is 2. So for every person that has it, they could infect 2 people. And that's one of the big problems with it. When you compare it with other diseases like measles and chickenpox, things like that, they've got very high infection rates. Their infection rates are, in sort of 10 or more. But because we've got vaccinations for those, and the effects of them are not that serious, well, measles, yes, can be, but for chickenpox, it's not as serious, then it's not as problematic as COVID-19. Our problem with COVID-19 is the high R rate, got for it, more than 1, and also the longer period of infection that you can be treated for, and the relatively high death rate as well. So again, you could discuss that with them. But yeah, a little practical experiment where they're passing it on, and how different surfaces can get infected as well. So they might be some of the lessons I might cover on that. And here we are. This again was an example I found online. I spent a bit of time looking for different graphs and so on, and it's comparing COVID-19 with flu, with influenza, and the R number, the number of people who might be infected, is higher for COVID. So again, this is an example of data handling and statistics and maths that the children could look at and can talk a little bit about. And this longer incubation time for COVID-19 is also problematic as well. And currently the hospitalization rate is very high, but we're not sure how accurate the reporting is, because we've only had a year's data or 6 months data on this. So again, you could talk to them about that. Flu has been around for decades, so we've got a lot of data to base that on. So yeah. So take a bit of time exploring this yourself, investigating it and seeing where it might fit into the teaching. So that's pretty much all I was going to talk through from that example today. I think we're going to lead on to Daisy next. So I'm going to stop sharing there. And I don't know if either Claire or Sally are going to come back at that point. I mean, I'm happy to answer any questions at the end, I think, if we've got time for that. But also, if you've got any comments you want to chuck into the chat as well, I can perhaps respond to too. So, yeah, hopefully that has been of interest.
Right, that's great. Thank you so much, Richard. That was absolutely fascinating. That was great. And I know there were a lot of positive comments from teachers in the chat box there. If you do have any questions, please hang on to them or pop them in the chat box just now. And I'm going to pass over to Daisy, who is an undergraduate student at the University of Aberdeen studying environmental science and technology. And we're so lucky that Daisy came along to volunteer for us, just a very short dot, just before lockdown actually. So I'm going to pass over to Daisy now. Okay, thanks Daisy.